panel with some wonderful panelists called How I Got Produced. And before we continue, I just want to thank Gary Young, who chaired our DramaPajama committee, and the rest of our committee for putting together, because this is ALAP's first ever big fall event that has gone virtual. But right now I am even more excited because with us, we have a Tony, Grammy, and Obie Award winning producer of Hadestown and more than 150 other productions on Broadway, off-Broadway, and around the US and abroad. She was a producing director of the McCarter Theater for 18 years. We are so excited to have her deliver our keynote. So please join me in a big virtual welcome for Mara Isaacs. Ooh.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak with all of you today. The timing of today's keynote, certainly coming off of yesterday's announcement about the latest suspension of performances, is not lost on me. Here we are, 7 months into the longest suspension of live performance in history. And look at you, you're all here. You know, we're all still moving forward and finding ways to connect and communicate and create. Events like this, I think, are the living embodiment of resilience. And I can think of no other group of people to demonstrate the kind of ingenuity and tenacity that is needed now than those of us who make theater. That said, I want to acknowledge the trauma and the pain and the uncertainty that many of us are experiencing. Broadway, and by extension, most live performance, is shut down until at least June of next year. We've witnessed a surge of racism and violence, and for some, they're seeing this clearly for the first time, what has always been there. I've seen how pandemic isolation and our political environment are affecting our ability to trust. We are seeing our sister unions attacking each other rather than banding together in a time of crisis. We have a government more concerned with fulfilling a partisan political agenda than taking care of its constituents who are deeply affected by the direct and indirect impact of the pandemic, and the list goes on. So we must ask, what has this time taught us? What matters now? How do we move forward? How do we take care of each other? About 7.5 years ago, I took a leap. I was working as an artistic producer, the producing director at McCarter Theater, and a leader in the not-for-profit theater world. And I founded Octopus Theatricals in order to control my own destiny. I didn't really know what was to come. All I knew was that there had to be a way of supporting and making work across a wide spectrum, from experimental to mainstream, with emerging and established artists, all in the service of singular artists creating singular theatrical experiences, whether they are in the smallest venues like Theater for One or Broadway like Hadestown and beyond. It's easy now for me to look back and trace my path, but it wasn't there when I started. I was, however, armed with a set of values and guiding principles that were key to the choices that I made. And as we face an uncertain future together, I'm going to share some of these principles with you today with the hope that they may be useful reminders for how we might navigate these uncharted territories. None of these principles are new or revolutionary, but by naming them and owning them, I think we can commit to putting them into practice. So the first principle is something I refer to as the 4 questions. These are not the 4 questions that are asked every Passover. Why is this night different than all other nights? Although that's useful as a dramaturgical question. These 4 questions are different. And the first of them is, what is the need? This is often the hardest question to answer, although sometimes it seems like the most obvious one. And for me, I really started incorporating this question into my practice almost 20 years ago. I was faced with a particularly thorny decision about, whether or not to take a job somewhere. And I did all the usual steps. I had the yellow pad with the plus column and the minus column. And as I made my lists, I kept getting stuck. Everything was equal, and I couldn't figure out how to move through to get to a decision. And my husband, who coincidentally is terrible at making decisions, started peppering me with questions. And the first question he asked me was, what is the need? And I realized I didn't know what the need was I was trying to address. And that's where my work began. And as I began to hone in on actually what was driving me, suddenly the decision-making became very clear. It's easy in crisis to lose sense of actually what the need is because we're being so reactive to the moment. And every one of us is coming from a different angle. But I challenge you to truly interrogate yourself to get at what is the need that you are trying to address. So that's the first of the 4 questions. The second is, have you considered all of your options? The third is, are you being honest with yourself? And this requires a great deal of sort of genuine self-assessment and analysis, as we often are in denial about our own feelings. And then the fourth is, does the choice that you're making reflect your core values and your value? And whether the decision you have to make is personal or professional, if it's artistic, if it's about a relationship, it's political. With each decision you have to make, I encourage you to ask yourself these questions. The second principle has to do with communication. Communication is key. We have to talk all the time. Don't rely on email and text messages or social media. Pick up the phone, hop on a video call. What we do is collaboration, and it involves all of our senses, seeing, hearing, when we're allowed to, touching. Too many times things go awry because people are afraid to say what they're really thinking, to really communicate. A young playwright once asked me, after I had been regaling them about an anecdote about working with someone who was notoriously difficult, what makes somebody difficult to work with? And my answer was not telling someone what you're really thinking or feeling. The difficult collaborator is not, in my experience, the one who's constantly in my face asking questions or posing challenges or concerns or requests. The difficult collaborator is the one who doesn't tell you what they're thinking, but has expectations for how you should anticipate or address their issues. How do you avoid this? Constantly ask, how are you? What are you thinking? What do you wish I knew that I don't know? What do you want to know from me that I haven't already shared with you? Don't leave with things unsaid, but say them kindly. Kindness includes saying the tough stuff, but it's ultimately more respectful than just telling people what you think they want to hear. That only sets us up for an inevitable letdown later on. Principle number 3 is about building trust. And this goes hand in hand with the communication we just talked about, as communication is a tool for building trust. And trust must go in both directions. You can't ask a collaborator, whether you are the writer, the producer, the director, the actor, to put their faith in you if you aren't equally willing to put your faith in them. Listen more than you talk. If you aren't willing to genuinely hear another point of view, how do you expect anyone to hear yours? Obviously, there are applications for this beyond creative practice. Embedded in building trust is genuine empathy. If you look at the situation from the perspective of your collaborator, what might you learn and discover, and how will that inform your approach? Principle 4 is follow through. This seems obvious, right? Implementing the idea is as important as creating the idea. Without the pragmatic details of implementation, creativity will fail. Or, as George Bernard Shaw once said, any fool can write a first act. Creativity requires the work ethic to see it through, to revise, and to revise again, and to ultimately take responsibility to finish the task and not to leave it to others to solve the problem. And speaking of problems, the next principle is be a problem solver. There's a really wonderful book called How to Reimagine the World by a writer named Anthony Weston, and in it he says, and this really resonated for me, radical imagination begins with a move beyond complaint and resistance, beyond reactive tinkering or hunkering down, or cynical accommodation. The first big move is to an alternative picture of how things could be instead. In other words, don't just stand by on the sidelines and criticize, and don't just acquiesce because it's easier. Get in there, do your part, whatever that might be. And keep going back to those initial questions I talked about. What's the need? Have you considered all of your options? Are you being honest with yourself? Does your solution reflect your core values, your principles, your vision? Understand that there are hundreds of ways to solve a problem, so keep looking. I sort of see it sometimes as a game of connect the dots. Sometimes the dots are really hard to see, but they exist, and our job as problem solvers is to connect them. Principle number 6, and this feels particularly resonant to me in this moment, we have to protect each other, or as I like to call it, be the glass wall. Although we hope that by putting all of these previous principles that I just talked about into practice, that we can avoid all confrontation and unpleasantness, we know that that's usually not the case. And in art making, as well as in life, the fear and vulnerability that comes with taking risks sometimes can lead to bad behavior. And in those cases, it's of the utmost importance to protect those in the line of fire in order to allow them to continue to create. Sometimes that means stepping in and providing a protective barrier. A while back, I was working on a volatile developmental process of a new play, and there was a video circulating at the time on YouTube in which there was a zoo exhibit where the people who were watching were inside a glass enclosed room, and outside of the room was the lion's habitat. And there was an unsuspecting infant sitting on the floor in front of the glass wall, and on the other side of the glass wall was a lioness pawing at the window, trying so hard to figure out how to get this little morsel of a human into her mouth. And it was only the wall that was preventing her from doing so. And at that time, when I was intervening on behalf of an artist who was being attacked by one of his collaborators, I realized I was that glass wall. It's scary to put yourself in that position, but we have to be willing to stick our necks out in order to protect others from bad or dangerous behavior. Principle 7 has to do with vision and mission. Knowing who you are and the context in which you are making work or making decisions is essential for making the right priorities rise to the surface. Having a clearly stated purpose is liberating and makes any decision-making much simpler because the criteria are understood and embraced. What story are you telling and why? Who are you making it for? Are you embodying your values in the way that you are creating? Worry less about how, but make sure you focus on the why. You don't have to have a plan, but you do have to have a reason. Principle 8 is to demand rigor. Is it good? Is it rigorous in its craft? Does it resonate beyond the particulars of the moment? And does it belong in the theater? I'm less interested in work that can be replicated in other forms. What is it about our particular genre that makes something unique and meaningful? Collaboration is difficult. If there's no friction, my guess is there's probably not enough rigor. It's also important to know your own capacity and to know when you need to bring in support to ensure that your vision is fully realized. Principle 9 is just about finding your sources of inspiration. Oh, and I should have said at the beginning, these are not in any particular order, sort of just as they came to me. If you're inspired, figure out why. Or I should say, if you're not inspired, figure out why and how you will remedy that. See and read and listen to as much as you can. Never stop learning, and find the ways to create the conditions for the ideas to appear. The next one is know what success means to you. Don't buy how the sector has defined itself or success. If you accept their definition, you'll fail to see the potential for innovation. That's certainly been very true in my own work. Be aware of the opportunities all around you waiting to be recognized. The rules of the past no longer apply. No matter where you sit on the theater-making spectrum, the world is upside down. This is the time to create the conditions for your creative process. In this moment, I would also encourage you to write and to write and to write the things that mean something to you, because at the end, that's all that matters. The next is say it out loud. The first step to realizing a dream is to say it out loud. I use talking to others as a way of thinking through and refining ideas. As you're describing it, watch the other person's face. Does it stick? Are you getting any reaction at all? Learn from how they're receiving the information you're saying, and then continue to revise and refine and distill the idea until it's truly understandable and digestible. Sometimes hearing one's own voice trying to articulate the idea reveals where the holes are. And then, of course, you need to go about filling them, and then you need to talk about it again. Of course, there's no use in talking about it if you aren't willing or able to take the actions you describe. So the next principle is just do it. But don't be an idiot about it. Think through the potential obstacles and how you will overcome them. But don't be paralyzed if you don't have a plan. Sometimes you just have to jump in with both feet and figure it out as you go. And if you do have a plan, make sure you're also able to improvise and stay flexible. When I first started articulating all of these principles, they were meant as morsels of personal encouragement. But as I reflect on them in our current context, I realize that they lay the groundwork for a bigger vision. This pandemic is not artists' problem to solve, and yet we are being tasked with imagining our collective future, as well as filling the current communal need for entertainment and virtual connection. Looking forward, we know that the performing arts will be a key ingredient to our society's spiritual and economic recovery, but we also know that the performing arts field will be forever changed. So what does the future hold? We must, as a community, challenge ourselves to make sure we have a viable ecosystem that supports the full spectrum of artists and audiences. The future of theater that I envision is driven by mission and purpose, that it resists the commoditization of our work, and it reinstates rigor in the place of complacency. We must communicate, build trust, create the conditions for values-driven practice. We must resist the traditional hierarchies of institutions as we have known them, and redefine what it means to build artistic work for one's community. We cannot replicate what has come before. We have to be breaking down barriers that have marginalized members of our theater field for so long. We must see the ways in which people are genuinely looking at changing practice. We must examine the ways in which we deal with each other and work with each other, and we must nurture a field that embodies equitable practice and the diversity of our society. As we face our greatest existential crisis, I'm strangely confident in our eventual reemergence. This time in isolation has only amplified the value of gathering by denying us that thing we crave, a shared experience that taps into the human condition. And so I ask you, what is the need? What matters now? What is your vision? How will you build trust? What will you do? How can the choices you are making reflect your value and your values? The reality is, making theater has never been for the faint of heart. Tenacity and optimism are required, and I do believe that if each of us puts these principles into practice, we can move the field forward together, both during the pandemic and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mara.
Thank you. That was amazing. So much to think about there. I'm going to go back and rewatch and take more notes. That was, I think it really does speak to the time that we are living in, that we really have to kind of rethink a lot of sort of some of our previous ideas about theater and